The Unique One: Understanding Max Stirner and the Philosophy of Radical Individualism. In this video, we'll break down one of the most radical and controversial philosophers of the 19th century. From his attack on all fixed ideas and abstractions, to his belief that the individual ego is the only reality worth acknowledging, to his vision of a society based on unions of egoists rather than moral obligations. This is Max Stirner. Born Johann Caspar Schmidt in 1806 in the Bavarian town of Bayreuth, he would become known by his nickname, Stirner, possibly derived from the German word for forehead, a physical feature that apparently stood out. But beneath this ordinary life lies one of the most radical and uncompromising thinkers in the history of philosophy. A man who dared to question everything that others held sacred, who understood that all the grand causes and noble ideals that govern human life are nothing but phantoms, ghosts that haunt and enslave us. Stirner was born into modest circumstances. His father, a flute maker, died of tuberculosis when Johann was only 6 months old. His mother remarried, and young Stirner grew up in a household marked by mental illness. His stepfather suffered from insanity, an experience that may have sensitized Stirner to questions about the nature of thought, sanity, and the power of ideas over human minds. He studied philosophy at the universities of Berlin, Erlangen, and Königsberg, attending lectures by some of the most prominent thinkers of his era, including Hegel, whose philosophy would become a primary target of Stirner's critique. After completing his studies, Stirner lived a relatively unremarkable life. He worked as a teacher at a girls' school in Berlin, a position far beneath his intellectual capabilities. He married twice, both marriages ending in personal and financial disaster. He participated in a discussion group of radical young Hegelians who met in a Berlin tavern, where he encountered figures like Bruno, Bauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, and the young Karl Marx. It was in this ferment of radical ideas that Stirner developed his philosophy, but a philosophy so extreme that even his fellow radicals found it shocking. In 1844, Stirner published his masterwork, Der Einzige und sein Eigentum, usually translated as The Ego and Its Own, or The Unique One and Its Property. The book was an immediate scandal. It attacked not just conventional morality and religion, but also the progressive and revolutionary movements of the day. It rejected humanism, socialism, liberalism, and every other ideology that claimed to speak for humanity or progress or justice. Stirner argued that all these systems were simply new religions, new ways of subordinating the individual to abstract ideals and collective demands. The book was met with outrage and attempted refutations from across the political spectrum. Even his former drinking companions turned against him. Marx devoted hundreds of pages to attacking Stirner in The German Ideology, though he never published this polemic during his lifetime. The Prussian authorities considered prosecuting Stirner for blasphemy and sedition, but ultimately decided the book was too obscure and philosophical to pose a real threat. They were wrong. Stirner's ideas would influence anarchists, individualists, existentialists, and countless others who felt suffocated by the demands of society, morality, and ideology. After publishing his book, Stirner's life declined into poverty and obscurity. His attempts at business failed spectacularly, landing him in debtor's prison. He died in 1856 at the age of 49 from an infected insect bite, alone and forgotten. His wife had left him, his debts were unpaid, and his revolutionary book seemed to have vanished without lasting impact. Only a handful of people attended his funeral. Yet Stirner's ideas refused to die. They resurfaced again and again, influencing thinkers who often didn't acknowledge or even know their source. His radical individualism anticipated Nietzsche's philosophy of self-creation and the death of God. His critique of ideology influenced anarchist movements from the late 19th century through today. His psychological insights anticipated aspects of existentialism and psychoanalysis. His defense of the ego influenced individualist anarchism in America and Europe. He remains one of the most radical voices in the history of philosophy, a thinker who refused every compromise and followed his logic to conclusions that still shock and disturb readers more than 150 years after his death. What makes Stirner unique among radical thinkers is his willingness to reject not just the old order, but the new one as well. Where other radicals replaced God with humanity, Stirner rejected both. Where revolutionaries replaced kings with the people, Stirner rejected all rulers. Where reformers replaced one set of moral obligations with another, Stirner rejected morality itself. He saw that every ideology, every cause, every grand narrative was simply another way of demanding that individuals sacrifice themselves for something outside themselves. And he said, no. Absolutely, uncompromisingly, radically no. His philosophy speaks to us across more than 170 years because he addressed questions that remain urgently relevant. How do we live authentically when society constantly demands we conform to roles and expectations? How do we find freedom when every ideology claims to liberate us while actually enslaving us? How do we think for ourselves when our very thoughts are shaped by cultural conditioning? How do we create meaning when all the traditional sources of meaning have been revealed as human constructions? These are not abstract academic questions, but practical challenges that every person who seeks genuine autonomy must face. Through his writing, often biting, sarcastic, and deliberately provocative, Stirner created a philosophy that remains as challenging and disturbing today as it was in the 1840s. He saw the individual ego as the only reality worth acknowledging, everything else as phantoms and spooks. He understood that every form of authority, whether political or moral or intellectual, is ultimately an imposition on individual autonomy. He recognized that true freedom comes not from finding the right cause to serve, but from ceasing to serve causes altogether. His ideas remain as relevant today as they were 180 years ago, perhaps even more so in our age of identity politics, social media moralism, and new forms of ideological conformity. Part 1. The War Against Fixed Ideas. The central concept in Stirner's philosophy is what he called fixed ideas, or spooks. The German word is Spuk, sometimes translated as ghosts or phantoms. These are abstract concepts that have taken on a life of their own in human consciousness. Concepts that began as human creations, but now rule over their creators. God, humanity, society, the state, morality, truth, justice, freedom itself. All of these are fixed ideas, ghosts that haunt the human mind and demand obedience. What makes an idea fixed in Stirner's sense? An idea becomes fixed when we treat it as having existence and authority independent of particular individuals. When we say society demands this, or morality requires that, or truth compels us to accept, we are treating these abstractions as having power over us. We are subordinating our actual, concrete existence to ideas that have no existence except in our minds. The fixed idea is an idea that has escaped our control and now controls us. Stirner's most powerful insight is recognizing that these fixed ideas operate exactly like traditional religion. When a believer says God commands this, they are subordinating their will to an abstraction. But when a humanist says humanity demands that, they are doing exactly the same thing. The content has changed, but the structure remains identical. Instead of worshipping God, modern people worship humanity, society, progress, or freedom. They have simply exchanged one set of masters for another. This insight was particularly shocking in Stirner's time because he applied it to the very movements that claimed to be liberating humanity from superstition and oppression. The liberals spoke of rights and freedom, but these were just new abstractions demanding obedience. The socialists spoke of humanity and equality, but these were just new gods replacing the old ones. Even the most radical atheists who rejected God still bowed down before reason or truth or nature. They had killed God only to resurrect him under new names. Consider how morality functions as a fixed idea. When someone says that is wrong, they are not expressing their own preference or interest. They are appealing to morality as an objective standard that exists independently of any individual. Morality tells us what we should do, what we are obligated to do, regardless of what we want or need. It demands that we sacrifice our interests for the sake of duty, principle, or the greater good. The moral person is precisely the person who subordinates their own desires to abstract rules. Stirner saw this as a fundamental attack on individual autonomy. Morality tells me that I must help others even when I don't want to, that I must tell the truth even when lying serves my interests, that I must keep promises even when breaking them would benefit me. In every case, morality demands that I subordinate my actual, concrete self to an abstract principle. It treats the principle as more real and more important than I am. The same applies to political ideologies. Liberalism speaks of the rights of man, but what are these rights? They are abstractions, ideas that supposedly exist before and above any actual human beings. The liberal insists that I must respect these rights, even when doing so conflicts with my interests or desires. I must not violate your freedom, even if controlling you would benefit me. I must respect your property, even if taking it would satisfy my needs. The rights of man are fixed ideas that claim authority over my actual existence. Socialism and communism are no better. They speak of humanity, the proletariat, the revolution, or the common good. These are simply new abstractions demanding new forms of obedience. The socialist tells me I must work for the collective rather than for myself, that I must subordinate my individual interests to class interests or to the needs of society. The revolutionary demands that I sacrifice myself for the revolution, for a future society that doesn't yet exist. In every case, the abstract ideal takes precedence over the concrete individual. Even science and reason can function as fixed ideas. When someone says, "science tells us," or "reason demands," they are treating these as authorities that stand above individual judgment. They are subordinating their own thinking to abstract standards of truth or rationality. Stirner recognized that even the pursuit of truth can become a form of slavery when it demands that we accept conclusions that contradict our interests, or when it forbids us from believing what serves our purposes. This doesn't mean Stirner advocated irrationality or believed that all ideas are equally false. Rather, he insisted that we should use ideas as tools that serve us, rather than treating them as masters we must serve. An idea is valuable when it helps me achieve my purposes, worthless when it doesn't. I should believe what empowers me and reject what enslaves me. The question is never, is this true? But, does this serve me? The fixed idea maintains its power through a psychological mechanism that Stirner analyzed brilliantly. The idea presents itself as sacred, as untouchable, as beyond criticism. To question God is blasphemy. To question morality is depravity. To question humanity is misanthropy. To question truth is irrationality. The fixed idea protects itself by making criticism seem not just wrong, but evil, insane, or impossible. It creates a circle of self-validation that is extremely difficult to escape. Moreover, fixed ideas gain power by masquerading as liberating forces. Christianity promised salvation and eternal life. Liberalism promises freedom and rights. Socialism promises equality and justice. Each ideology presents itself as the path to human liberation. But Stirner saw that each actually imposes new forms of enslavement. They liberate us from old masters only to impose new ones. They free us from external authorities only to implant those authorities within our own minds as internalized commands. The most insidious aspect of fixed ideas is that they make us police ourselves. We don't need external authorities to enforce morality when we have internalized moral rules. We don't need a king to command us when we have internalized the authority of society or humanity. The fixed idea is more effective than physical coercion because it makes us voluntarily subordinate ourselves. We become our own jailers, our own slave masters, our own inquisitors. Stirner illustrated this with vivid examples. The devout Christian whips himself for impure thoughts. The devoted patriot sacrifices his life for his country. The committed revolutionary gives up personal happiness for the cause. The moral person torments himself with guilt for violating principles. In each case, the individual is subordinating their actual existence to an abstraction, treating the idea as more real and more important than themselves. Recognizing fixed ideas and freeing ourselves from them is the first step toward genuine autonomy. But it is extraordinarily difficult because these ideas are not simply external impositions. They are woven into the very fabric of our thinking, our language, our emotions. We have been raised to believe in them, educated to respect them, conditioned to internalize them. They feel natural and necessary rather than arbitrary and optional. Breaking free requires recognizing that all these sacred abstractions are human creations, ideas we made up and can unmake. Part 2. The ego and its own. If fixed ideas are the enemy, what is the alternative? Stirner's answer is simple and radical. The ego, the individual, the unique one. Not the abstract individual of liberal philosophy, not the species being of humanist philosophy, but the concrete particular ego that each of us is. This ego is the only reality that matters, the only foundation that cannot be questioned or dissolved into something else. What does Stirner mean by the ego? He means the actual, existing individual in all their particularity and uniqueness. Not the individual as member of humanity or citizen of the state or bearer of rights, but the individual as themselves, irreducible to any category or concept. The ego is not an abstraction or essence, but a living, desiring, acting being. It is what remains when we strip away all the fixed ideas, all the roles, all the identities that society imposes. Stirner begins with a simple observation. I am the one who experiences, desires, thinks, and acts. Everything else, God, humanity, truth, morality, exists only insofar as it appears to this I, only insofar as it affects this concrete ego. To say that something exists independently of me means only that I conceive it as existing independently. The ego is the necessary starting point and ending point of all philosophy, because it is the only perspective from which anything can be known or valued. This might sound like solipsism, the view that only I exist and everything else is my idea. But Stirner is not making a metaphysical claim about what exists. He is making a practical and existential point about what matters. Other people exist, certainly. The physical world exists. But they matter only insofar as they relate to me, affect me, serve my interests, or threaten them. The question is never whether something exists in some abstract sense, but what it means for me, how it affects my life. Stirner rejects the traditional philosophical quest for universal truths, or absolute values. These are simply more fixed ideas, more ways of subordinating the individual to abstractions. There is no universal human nature that all individuals share, no essence of humanity that defines what we should be. Each ego is unique, irreducible to any general category. What is good for one person may be bad for another. What one person values, another may despise. There is no common measure, no shared standard by which to judge. This radical individualism extends even to self-understanding. Stirner rejects the idea that the ego has a fixed nature or essence that it must discover or realize. The ego is not a substance, but a process, not a being, but a becoming. It has no nature except what it makes of itself through its actions and choices. There is no true self to find beneath social conditioning, no authentic self waiting to be liberated. The ego creates itself continuously through what it does. This means that self-knowledge is impossible in the traditional sense. There is no stable self to know because the ego is constantly changing, constantly creating itself anew. The question, "Who am I?" has no fixed answer. I am whatever I make myself in this moment. Tomorrow I may be something different. The idea of a true or authentic self is simply another fixed idea, another abstraction that claims authority over the living, changing ego. Stirner uses the term the unique one, der Einzige, to emphasize the ego's irreducibility. Each person is unique, incomparable, beyond categorization. To classify someone as human or rational or social is to miss what is most important about them: their uniqueness, their particularity, their irreducible difference from everyone else. The unique one cannot be captured in concepts because concepts are general while the ego is singular. This uniqueness is not something to be proud of or to cultivate. It is simply a fact, the fundamental fact of existence. You are unique not because you have special qualities or talents, but simply because you are you, and not someone else. This uniqueness is not an achievement, but a given. Not something to live up to, but something you cannot escape. You are stuck being yourself, and this is both your limitation and your freedom. What does the ego want? Stirner's answer is straightforward. The ego wants what it wants. It seeks its own satisfaction, its own pleasure, its own power. It has no obligation to pursue anything else. The very idea of obligation is a fixed idea that subordinates the ego to external demands. The ego is accountable to nothing and no one but itself. It is its own measure, its own judge, its own purpose. This sounds like simple hedonism or selfishness, but Stirner means something more subtle. He is not saying that the ego always pursues pleasure or always acts selfishly in the conventional sense. He is saying that whatever the ego pursues, it pursues because it wants to, not because it ought to. If I help others, it is because helping them satisfies something in me, not because morality demands it. If I sacrifice for a cause, it is because the cause matters to me, not because the cause has objective importance. The ego's interests are not necessarily material or crude. I might find satisfaction in intellectual pursuits, artistic creation, or meaningful relationships. I might enjoy helping others or working for social change. The point is not what I pursue, but why. I pursue these things because I want them, because they satisfy me, not because they are objectively valuable or because I ought to pursue them. The moment I act from duty rather than desire, from obligation rather than interest, I have subordinated myself to a fixed idea. Stirner makes a crucial distinction between the ego and egoism. Egoism is a moral doctrine, a principle that says we ought to pursue our own interests. But this makes egoism just another fixed idea, another abstract principle claiming authority over the individual. The ego doesn't follow the principle of egoism, it simply acts according to its wants and needs. Stirner is not advocating egoism as a moral philosophy, but describing the ego as a fact of existence. This raises an obvious question. If every ego simply pursues its own interests, won't this lead to chaos and conflict? Stirner's answer is yes, and that's fine. Conflict is natural when different egos have incompatible interests. The question is not how to eliminate conflict through moral rules or social contracts, but how individuals can pursue their interests in a world where others are doing the same. This leads to Stirner's radical reconception of social relationships. Part 3. Property and Power. Traditional philosophy and politics start from the assumption that property must be justified. Liberal philosophy justifies it through labor and natural rights. Socialist philosophy condemns it as theft and exploitation. But Stirner approaches property from an entirely different angle. He doesn't ask whether property is just or unjust, legitimate or illegitimate. He asks, what can I take and hold? For Stirner, property is not a legal or moral category, but a practical one. Something is my property when I can possess and use it, when I have the power to exclude others from it. Property is based on might, not right. This is not a normative claim that might makes right. It is a descriptive claim that might makes property. Rights are simply claims that may or may not be respected, depending on whether I have the power to enforce them. This applies to all forms of property, not just material possessions. My body is my property because I control it and can defend it from others. My thoughts are my property because they occur in my consciousness, and I can keep them private if I choose. My reputation is my property to the extent that I can shape how others perceive me. Everything is potentially my property if I have the power to appropriate and use it. Stirner completely inverts the conventional relationship between property and rights. Liberalism says I have a right to property, and therefore property is legitimate when acquired through proper means. Stirner says I have property when I can take and hold it, and rights are simply abstractions that may or may not reflect actual power relations. The question is never whether I have a right to something, but whether I have the power to take it and the will to use that power. This extends to the self as property. In traditional philosophy, the self is given, natural, essential. For Stirner, even the self must be appropriated, made into property. I must take possession of myself, owning my body, my mind, my capacities. This self-ownership is not a natural right, but an achievement, something that must be won from all the forces that seek to control and use me for their purposes. Who seeks to control and use the self? Society, the state, morality, ideology. All the fixed ideas that demand I subordinate myself to their requirements. They claim ownership over me, the right to command my obedience, to direct my actions, to judge my worth. Taking possession of myself means rejecting these claims, refusing to recognize any authority over my own existence. It means making myself my own property rather than the property of abstractions. But power is not something possessed once and for all. It must be continuously exercised and renewed. I am my own property only so long as I actively maintain that ownership against all the forces that seek to dispossess me. The moment I accept an obligation, internalize a moral rule, or subordinate myself to a cause, I have given away ownership of myself. Self-ownership requires constant vigilance and continuous resistance to all forms of external authority. Stirner applies this analysis to political power. The state claims authority over individuals, the right to command obedience and punish disobedience. But this authority is simply a claim backed by force. The state is powerful when individuals accept its authority and obey its commands. It loses power when individuals reject its authority and refuse obedience. Political power is not legitimate or illegitimate. It is simply the relationship between those who command and those who obey. This means that every state, regardless of its form, is based on the subordination of individuals to abstractions. Monarchy subordinates individuals to the king. Democracy subordinates individuals to the people or the majority. Every form of government treats individual egos as means to collective ends, as parts of a whole that is supposedly more real and important than its members. The form may change, but the fundamental relationship remains the same. Stirner was particularly critical of democracy because it disguises this subordination as self-government. When the majority rules, we are told that the people govern themselves. But the individuals who compose the minority are governed by others just as surely as subjects of a king. The fact that they had a vote doesn't change the reality that they must obey laws they oppose. Democracy replaces "I command" with "we command." But the individual is still commanded, still subordinated to a will that is not their own. The same applies to law. Laws are not objective rules that bind everyone equally. They are commands backed by force. I obey laws not because they are legitimate or just, but because the state has the power to punish me for disobedience. The question is never whether a law is just, but whether I am willing to risk the consequences of breaking it. Morality tells me I ought to obey just laws. Stirner says I will obey when the cost of disobedience exceeds the benefit of violation. This might seem to advocate crime and violence, but Stirner is more subtle than this. He is not saying I should break laws or commit crimes. He is saying that my decision whether to obey or disobey should be based on my own interests and judgment, not on abstract principles of legality or morality. Sometimes obeying serves my interests, sometimes disobeying does. The point is that I am the judge, not law or morality. Property and ideas deserve special attention. Stirner lived before intellectual property law became the pervasive system it is today, but his analysis applies perfectly. Ideas cannot be property in the traditional sense because they cannot be exclusively possessed. When I share an idea with you, I still have it. You cannot take my ideas from me by force. But the state tries to create artificial scarcity through copyright and patent laws, treating ideas as if they were material objects that can be owned and controlled. For Stirner, this is simply another example of using law to create property that would not exist naturally. I can claim ownership of an idea, but this ownership exists only so long as others respect my claim. If they copy my idea and use it for themselves, they have made it their property. I can try to prevent this through law or force, but the idea itself, once expressed, cannot be exclusively possessed. It becomes available to anyone who can grasp and use it. The concept of theft becomes complicated in Stirner's framework. Conventional morality says theft is wrong because it violates property rights. But if property is based on power rather than rights, then what we call theft is simply one person taking from another what the other cannot defend. The question is not whether theft is moral or immoral, but whether the thief has the power to take and hold what they take, and whether the victim has the power to prevent or punish the taking. This doesn't mean Stirner advocated theft or violence. He recognized that most people value security and stability and will create arrangements to protect these. But these arrangements are based on mutual interest and relative power, not on moral principles or natural rights. I refrain from taking your property not because stealing is wrong, but because the consequences of theft outweigh the benefits, or because I value the social peace that comes from respecting possessions, or simply because I don't want what you have. Part 4. The Union of Egoists. If Stirner rejects all forms of authority and obligation, how does he envision people relating to each other? His answer is the union of egoists, Verein von Egoisten, a voluntary association based entirely on mutual self-interest rather than on moral obligations, legal bonds, or shared ideology. This is perhaps the most original and least understood aspect of Stirner's philosophy. The union of egoists is fundamentally different from conventional social organizations. The state is based on subordination to law and authority. Moral communities are based on shared values and mutual obligations. Economic organizations are structured by property rights and contracts. But the union of egoists is based on nothing more than the recognition that individuals can sometimes achieve their purposes better through cooperation than through isolation or conflict. Each member of a union joins and remains for purely selfish reasons. They participate because and only because participation serves their interests. The moment participation becomes burdensome or constraining, they are free to leave. There are no obligations, no duties, no commitments that bind beyond the individual's current will. The union exists only so long as it serves all its members. It dissolves the moment it ceases to do so. This might sound like a social contract in the liberal tradition, but Stirner is explicitly rejecting contract theory. A contract is a fixed idea that claims authority over the individuals who made it. It says you must keep your promises, honor your agreements, fulfill your obligations. But the egoist recognizes no such must. If breaking a contract serves my interests better than keeping it, and if I'm willing to accept the consequences, I will break it. Promises bind only so long as I choose to be bound. The union of egoists also differs from communist or socialist visions of voluntary association. These typically imagine people cooperating based on solidarity, altruism, or shared commitment to collective welfare. But Stirner rejects all these motivations as fixed ideas. I don't cooperate with you because we are both human, both workers, or both committed to justice. I cooperate because cooperation serves my purposes. The moment it doesn't, I stop. How would such unions actually function? Stirner provides few details, but the basic principle is clear. Individuals would form temporary associations to achieve purposes that require cooperation. These associations would last only as long as they served all participants. They would have no authority over individuals, no right to command obedience or demand sacrifice. Members would contribute what they choose to contribute and take what they have the power to take. This seems anarchic and unstable, and Stirner would agree. The union of egoists is inherently unstable because it exists only through the continued voluntary participation of individuals pursuing their own interests. But Stirner sees this instability as a feature, not a bug. Stable organizations tend to develop their own authority, their own fixed ideas, their own demands for loyalty and sacrifice. The instability of the union prevents it from becoming an authority over its members. Violence and conflict are not eliminated in Stirner's vision. When individuals' interests clash and cannot be reconciled through cooperation, they will struggle against each other. But this struggle is honest and direct, rather than being disguised as justice or morality. I don't claim that you ought to submit to me based on moral principles or legal rights. I simply try to prevail through superior power or cunning. You do the same. We either reach an accommodation or one of us wins. This might seem brutal, but Stirner would argue it is more honest than conventional morality. Morality disguises power relationships as principles, making domination seem legitimate and natural. The strong claim they have rights while the weak have duties. The wealthy claim their property is sacred while the poor are told not to steal. Every moral system, Stirner believed, functions to justify and perpetuate existing power relationships while pretending to be universal and impartial. The union of egoists makes power relationships explicit and negotiable. I cooperate with you because we both benefit. I stop cooperating when the benefits cease. We may threaten each other, bargain with each other, or compromise with each other, But we don't appeal to abstract principles that supposedly bind us. We deal with each other directly, ego to ego, based on our actual interests and relative power. Love and friendship fit into this framework as forms of egoistic satisfaction. I love someone because loving them satisfies me, not because they deserve love, or because love is a moral obligation. The moment the relationship ceases to satisfy me, I am free to end it. This sounds cold and calculating, but Stirner would say it is simply honest. Every relationship is maintained by the will of those involved. Pretending that love creates obligations or that relationships impose duties simply obscures the reality that we stay in relationships because we want to, and we are free to leave when we want to. This raises difficult questions about child rearing and dependency. Children cannot survive without care, and they cannot reciprocate the benefits they receive. Do parents have obligations to their children? Stirner would say no. Parents care for children because doing so satisfies something in them: affection, desire for continuation, social pressure, or simply the inability to abandon a helpless being they created. When parents sacrifice for children, they do so for their own reasons, not because they ought to. This analysis might seem to threaten social cohesion, but Stirner believed that recognizing the truth about relationships would actually make them more genuine and more stable. Relationships based on honest self-interest are more reliable than relationships based on duty or obligation. When I help you because I want to, you can trust my assistance more than if I help because I believe I ought to. Duty creates resentment. Desire creates authentic engagement. The union of egoists represents Stirner's alternative to all forms of social organization based on authority, obligation, or fixed ideas. It is radically voluntary, radically individualistic, and radically honest about the nature of human relationships. Whether such unions could actually function in practice is questionable, but that may not be Stirner's point. He is describing a regulative ideal, a way of thinking about relationships that refuses all the mystifications of morality and politics. Part 5. Consciousness and Self-Creation. Stirner's understanding of consciousness and self-creation anticipates themes that would later become central to existentialism. If the ego has no fixed nature or essence, if it is not bound by moral obligations or natural purposes, then it must create itself through its choices and actions. This self-creation is not a one-time event, but a continuous process. The ego is always becoming, never simply being. Traditional philosophy sought to discover the true nature of the self through introspection or reason. Religious traditions taught that the self must be purified or perfected according to divine standards. Moral philosophy prescribed how the self ought to develop, but Stirner rejects all these approaches. There is no true self to discover, no divine standard to meet, no ought that defines proper development. The ego creates itself freely without reference to any external or internal standard. This freedom is both exhilarating and terrifying. Without any fixed nature or purpose, the ego faces an open future of unlimited possibilities. It can become anything, do anything, value anything. Nothing is forbidden or required. Nothing is impossible or necessary. The ego is radically free to determine itself. But this very freedom creates anxiety because it removes all guidance and all guarantees. The ego cannot look to nature, God, or reason to tell it what to be. It must decide for itself without criteria. Stirner analyzes how societies and ideologies try to limit this freedom by imposing fixed ideas about what the self should be. Christianity teaches that you are a sinner who needs salvation. Humanism teaches that you are a rational being who should pursue knowledge. Nationalism teaches that you are a member of a nation with duties to your people. Every ideology provides a script for the self to follow, a predefined role to play. These scripts are seductive because they relieve the burden of self-creation. If I am essentially a Christian or a socialist or a citizen, then I know what I should do, how I should think, what values I should hold. The script provides meaning and purpose without the need for constant decision and self-invention. But accepting the script means subordinating my actual existence to an abstract idea of what I should be. It means living as a character rather than as myself. Breaking free from these scripts requires recognizing them as external impositions rather than expressions of my true nature. There is no true nature. I am not essentially anything. I am whatever I make myself through my choices and actions. This recognition is deeply unsettling because it removes the security of fixed identity. I can no longer say, "This is who I am," as if that were a fact beyond my control. I can only say, "This is who I am making myself at this moment." The process of self-creation occurs through what Stirner calls owning or appropriating one's powers and capacities. I do not simply have abilities. I must take possession of them, make them mine, use them for my purposes. My reason is not a divine gift that obligates me to pursue truth. It is a tool I can use or ignore as I see fit. My conscience is not the voice of God or moral law. It is a social conditioning I can accept or reject. This appropriation extends even to aspects of myself that seem most natural and given. My body is not simply mine by nature. I must take ownership of it, using it for my purposes rather than allowing others to use it for theirs. Society tells me how I should use my body, what work I should do, what pleasures I should pursue, what risks I should take. Taking ownership means deciding these things for myself, based on my own desires, rather than external demands. Language and concepts also must be appropriated, rather than simply accepted. The words I use shape how I think and what I can imagine. If I accept conventional concepts uncritically, I am thinking society's thoughts rather than my own. If I use moral language, I am automatically imposing obligations on myself. If I speak of rights, I am treating abstractions as authoritative. Genuine autonomy requires creating one's own language, one's own concepts, one's own ways of thinking. This doesn't mean inventing entirely new words, which would make communication impossible. It means using existing words consciously and critically, aware that they carry implicit assumptions and values. When I use the word ought, I should recognize that I am importing moral assumptions. When I speak of justice, I should understand that I am invoking an abstract ideal. The goal is not to avoid these words, but to use them as tools rather than being used by them. Self-creation also involves what Stirner calls dissolution or destruction. Before I can create myself anew, I must dissolve the fixed ideas that currently define me. I must destroy the social conditioning, the internalized authorities, the moral obligations that constrain my possibilities. This is not physical destruction, but psychological liberation. It is recognizing that all these constraints are ultimately self-imposed and can be removed by an act of will. This process is never complete. New fixed ideas constantly threaten to colonize consciousness. Social conditioning is ongoing, not a one-time event that can be undone once and for all. The ego must continuously resist the formation of new fixed ideas, continuously dissolve new constraints, continuously renew its freedom. Self-creation is not a project that can be finished, but a practice that must be maintained throughout life. Stirner recognizes that complete freedom from all fixed ideas is probably impossible. We are social, beings who cannot help but be influenced by culture language, and relationships. The goal is not to achieve pure autonomy, which would be isolation rather than freedom, but to become conscious of the fixed ideas that shape us and to choose actively which ones to accept and which to reject. Even this conscious choosing must be done carefully to avoid making choice itself into a fixed idea that demands consistency or coherence. The ego that engages in self-creation is not a unified, coherent self. It is multiple, contradictory, changeable. Today I value one thing. Tomorrow I may value something different. Today I am one way, tomorrow I may be another. This is not hypocrisy or incoherence, but the natural consequence of freedom from fixed nature. Consistency itself is a fixed idea that demands I remain the same, rather than changing as my interests and circumstances change. Part 6. Beyond Good and Evil. Stirner's critique of morality is perhaps the most radical aspect of his philosophy and the one that provoked the most outrage. He does not advocate replacing conventional morality with a better moral system. He rejects morality altogether as a category. The very distinction between good and evil is a fixed idea that subordinates individual judgment to abstract standards. Morality, in Stirner's analysis, functions through a basic structure. It divides actions, characteristics, and desires into good and evil, right and wrong, permissible and forbidden. It then tells individuals they ought to pursue the good and avoid the evil. This ought is the key mechanism through which morality exercises power. It claims authority over individual desire, telling people not to do what they want, but what they should want. Every moral system, regardless of its specific content, shares this basic structure. Christian morality says you ought to love your neighbor and avoid sin. Utilitarian morality says you ought to maximize overall happiness. Kantian morality says you ought to follow the categorical imperative. The content varies, but the structure remains the same. An abstract principle claims authority over individual desire and demands obedience. Stirner saw that this structure is essentially religious, even when the content is secular. When a religious believer says, "God commands this," they are subordinating their will to divine authority. When a moral philosopher says, "Reason demands that," or "Justice requires this," they are doing exactly the same thing with different words. They have replaced God with reason or justice, but the structure of subordination remains unchanged. What would it mean to live beyond good and evil? It would mean making decisions based on what serves one's interests, rather than what one ought to do. It would mean rejecting guilt, shame, and moral obligation as mechanisms of social control. It would mean recognizing that actions are not inherently right or wrong, but only more or less useful, more or less aligned with one's purposes. This doesn't mean that anything goes or that all actions are equivalent. The egoist will still make distinctions and judgments, but these will be based on personal preference and practical consequences rather than on moral principles. I don't help someone because helping is good or because I ought to help. I help because I want to, because helping satisfies something in me, because I value the relationship, or because I expect reciprocation. The moment these reasons disappear, I have no obligation to continue helping. Conventional morality would call this selfishness and condemn it as evil. But Stirner rejects the very distinction between selfishness and altruism as another false dichotomy. Every action, he argues, is selfish in the sense that I do it because I want to, because it satisfies something in me. Even the most apparently altruistic action, sacrificing myself for others, is something I do because I want to do it, because making the sacrifice satisfies some desire or need in me. The person who sacrifices for others is not morally superior to the person who pursues obvious self-interest. They are simply satisfying different desires. One finds satisfaction in helping others, another finds satisfaction in acquiring wealth. One enjoys the feeling of being virtuous, another enjoys sensual pleasures. These are differences in taste, not differences in moral worth. There is no objective standpoint from which to judge one better than the other. Guilt is a particularly important mechanism through which morality exercises control. When we violate moral rules, we feel guilty. This guilt is internalized punishment, a way of enforcing moral rules without external authority. Stirner saw guilt as a form of self-torture, a way of attacking oneself for failing to live up to abstract standards. The truly free individual recognizes guilt as simply a conditioned response that can be overcome through conscious awareness. Shame functions similarly. It makes us care about how others judge us according to moral standards we may not accept. We feel ashamed when we fail to meet social expectations, even when we consciously reject those expectations. Overcoming shame requires ceasing to care about moral judgments, ceasing to internalize others' values as measures of self-worth. This is difficult because social conditioning runs deep, but it is necessary for genuine autonomy. Stirner's position might seem to lead to nihilism, to the belief that nothing matters and all values are meaningless. But this misunderstands his project. He is not saying that nothing matters, but that only what matters to me matters. Value is not objective or universal, but personal and particular. I create value through my desires and choices. What I value has value for me, regardless of whether others value it or whether it has any cosmic significance. This means that I can commit myself passionately to projects, people, and pursuits without believing they are objectively important. I can love someone without believing that love is good or that this person deserves love. I can work toward goals without believing that these goals are worth pursuing for everyone. I can create meaning without believing that this meaning exists independently of my creating it. The beyond good and evil perspective also changes how we think about justice. Conventional morality treats justice as an objective standard that determines what people deserve, what rights they have, how resources should be distributed. But Stirner sees justice as simply another fixed idea, another abstraction that claims authority over individuals. What we call justice is actually the interest of those powerful enough to define and enforce it. This doesn't mean that we can't make judgments or that all outcomes are equally acceptable. It means that these judgments are based on interests rather than on moral principles. I want outcomes that serve my purposes. I oppose outcomes that harm my interests. I may use the language of justice to advocate for these outcomes, but I should recognize this as rhetoric rather than as appeal to objective truth. Part 7. Critique of Humanism and Socialism. Stirner reserved some of his harshest criticism for the progressive movements of his time: humanism, liberalism, and socialism. These movements claimed to liberate humanity from religious superstition and political oppression, but Stirner saw them as simply creating new forms of slavery, new fixed ideas demanding obedience. Humanism had replaced God with humanity as the object of worship and service. Instead of saying serve God, humanists said serve humanity. Instead of deriving morality from divine commandments, they derived it from human nature or human needs. But Stirner saw that this was still subordinating individuals to an abstraction. Humanity is not a concrete, existing being, but an idea, a concept that includes all individual humans, but is not identical to any of them. When humanists speak of the rights of man or human dignity, they are treating these abstractions as more important than actual individuals. They tell me I must respect humanity in every person, treat people as ends rather than means, recognize universal human rights. But these are all demands that I subordinate my interests to an abstract ideal. The fact that the ideal is human rather than divine does not make it less of an imposition. Liberalism promised freedom through rights, law, and limited government. But Stirner saw that liberal freedom is another fixed idea. It defines freedom as absence of interference, as having rights that others must respect. This ignores the reality that rights are simply claims backed by power. I have rights only insofar as others recognize them, and others recognize them only when doing so serves their interests or when they lack the power to violate them. Moreover, liberal freedom is purely negative. Freedom from interference rather than freedom to act. But the egoist wants actual power to do and take what they desire, not merely the absence of interference. A beggar has liberal freedom from slavery, but lacks the power to satisfy basic needs. The egoist recognizes that power matters more than rights, that actual capacity to act matters more than abstract freedom from interference. Socialism promised equality and collective ownership. But Stirner saw that socialism simply replaces individual owners with collective ownership, individual masters with collective authority. The socialist tells me that property should belong to everyone, meaning it belongs to society rather than to individuals. But society is another abstraction, another fixed idea. Collective ownership means that I don't own anything. Everything belongs to the collective, which uses it for collective purposes rather than individual ones. Even more problematically, socialism demands that individuals work for the common good rather than for themselves, that they subordinate personal interests to collective welfare, that they accept equality as a principle worth sacrificing for. These are simply new moral demands, new ways of telling individuals they ought to live for something beyond themselves. Socialism replaces the tyranny of individual property owners with the tyranny of the collective. Stirner was particularly critical of Marx and other socialist thinkers who spoke of liberating humanity or achieving human emancipation. Humanity, he pointed out, is not enslaved and cannot be liberated. Only individual people are enslaved, and they are enslaved precisely by abstractions like humanity, society, and the common good. Attempting to liberate humanity means imposing new abstractions, new fixed ideas, new forms of enslavement. The socialist vision of the future society is still a society with authority, still based on individuals subordinating themselves to collective decisions and collective purposes. Whether decisions are made democratically or through revolutionary vanguards, individuals are still being governed, still being told what they must do and what they cannot do. The fact that the authority claims to represent the people or the proletariat does not change its nature as authority. Stirner saw that progressive movements face a fundamental contradiction. They want to liberate people from existing authorities and hierarchies, but they do so by appealing to new authorities and creating new hierarchies. They attack religious authority in the name of reason. They attack political tyranny in the name of justice. They attack economic exploitation in the name of equality. But reason, justice, and equality are just new masters replacing old ones. This critique led Stirner to reject all revolutionary and reform movements that aimed at creating better societies based on better principles. Every such movement necessarily creates new fixed ideas, new abstract ideals that claim authority over individuals. The content of these ideals may be more appealing than traditional religion and monarchy, but the structure remains the same. Individuals must subordinate themselves to abstractions. Stirner's alternative is not a program or movement, but an attitude. The egoist recognizes all ideologies as fixed ideas and refuses to serve any of them. This doesn't mean the egoist is apolitical or inactive. They may join movements and work toward goals. but they do so for their own reasons, because these activities serve their interests, not out of commitment to the cause or belief in the ideology. The moment participation ceases to serve them, they withdraw. This attitude toward movements and causes might seem cynical or opportunistic, but Stirner would argue it is simply honest. People who claim to be motivated purely by principle are either self-deceived or dishonest. Everyone acts from self-interest, but ideological movements encourage people to disguise their interests as principles, their desires as duties. Recognizing and openly acknowledging self-interest leads to more honest and more effective action. Zubuant. Part 8. Self-ownership and liberation. The concept of self-ownership is central to Stirner's vision of liberation, but it means something different from how liberals or libertarians use the term. For Stirner, self-ownership is not a natural right, but an achievement, not a legal status, but a practice. I own myself only insofar as I actively take possession of myself and defend that possession against all who would use me for their purposes. Who seeks to own me if not myself? The list is long. Parents who try to shape me according to their values, schools that try to mold me into productive citizens, religions that try to make me serve God, states that try to make me serve the nation, employers who try to extract my labor, ideologies that try to make me serve causes. Everyone and everything wants to use me as a means to their ends. Self-ownership means resisting these claims and using myself exclusively for my own purposes. This resistance must be both external and internal. External. Resistance means refusing to obey authorities, rejecting imposed obligations, declining to serve causes I don't personally value. But internal resistance is more difficult and more important. I must resist the internalized authorities, the fixed ideas I have accepted and made part of my own thinking. I must recognize that my conscience is social conditioning, that my moral sense is imposed rather than natural, that my very desires have been shaped by forces that want to use me. Taking possession of oneself requires a kind of violence, not physical violence but psychological violence against the fixed ideas that claim ownership. Stirner speaks of this as insurrection, a rising up against all internal authorities. This insurrection is different from revolution. Revolution seeks to replace bad authorities with good ones, bad social systems with better ones. Insurrection seeks to free the individual from all authorities without creating new ones. The distinction is crucial. Revolution is collective action aimed at transforming society. Insurrection is individual action aimed at transforming oneself. Revolution appeals to principles like justice or equality. Insurrection appeals to nothing beyond the ego's desire for self-ownership. Revolution creates new obligations and new forms of authority. Insurrection dissolves all obligations and authorities. Revolution is political. Insurrection is existential. This insurrection must be ongoing, not a single event. New fixed ideas constantly try to colonize consciousness. New authorities constantly emerge claiming legitimacy. Social conditioning is continuous, not something that happens once in childhood and then ends. The ego must constantly reassert ownership of itself, constantly dissolve new constraints, constantly resist new impositions. Education is a primary means through which society tries to prevent self-ownership. From early childhood, we are taught what to think, how to behave, what to value. We are told that some things are good and others evil, that some actions are right and others wrong, that some desires are legitimate and others shameful. All of this is designed to create individuals who will serve social purposes rather than their own. Stirner saw that education inevitably involves indoctrination, because it seeks to shape the child according to predetermined ideals rather than allowing the child to develop according to their own nature and desires. Even progressive education that claims to respect the child's autonomy typically does so in the name of principles: respect for the individual, development of rational capacity, cultivation of moral sentiment. These principles are themselves impositions, ways of defining what the child should become. True education would mean providing children with tools and capacities while leaving them free to use these as they choose. It would mean teaching skills without imposing values, providing information without demanding particular conclusions, offering possibilities without prescribing purposes. Whether such education is possible in practice is questionable, but it represents the ideal implied by Stirner's philosophy. Self-ownership also requires economic independence. If I must sell my labor to survive, I am not fully my own. The employer owns my time and directs my activities during work hours. The need to work constrains what I can do with my life. Stirner recognized this without developing a detailed economic program. He simply noted that economic dependence is a form of slavery that limits self-ownership. But Stirner was not a socialist who sought collective ownership as a solution. Collective ownership would simply mean being owned by society rather than by individual employers. The egoist seeks actual power over resources needed for survival and flourishing, not abstract rights or collective ownership. How this power is obtained, through individual appropriation, voluntary cooperation, or other means, is less important than that it actually exists. Self-ownership ultimately means living consciously rather than automatically, making decisions rather than following scripts, taking responsibility for one's choices rather than blaming circumstances or obeying authorities. It means recognizing that I am not bound by my past selves, that I can change my values and priorities, that I can create myself anew at any moment. It means living as the unique one I am, rather than as a representative of humanity, citizen, or any other category. Part 9. Death and Finitude. Stirner's philosophy confronts death with stark honesty. There is no afterlife, no immortal soul, no cosmic meaning that survives individual extinction. Death is the absolute end of the individual ego. This finitude is not something to be overcome or transcended, but simply accepted as fact. The ego exists temporarily, burns briefly, and then is extinguished forever. Religious traditions promise life after death as compensation for earthly suffering. Philosophical systems seek eternal truths that transcend individual mortality. Ideological movements offer symbolic immortality through participation in something larger than oneself. But Stirner rejects all these consolations as illusions, as ways of denying the reality of death rather than facing it honestly. This acceptance of finitude has profound implications. If this life is all there is, then living according to abstract principles or for future rewards is simply wasting the only existence I have. If there is no ultimate meaning or purpose, then I am free to create my own meaning without reference to cosmic significance. If death ends everything, then what matters is how I live now, not what I might become or what might survive me. The awareness of death creates urgency. Time is limited and cannot be recovered. Every moment spent serving abstractions, fulfilling obligations, or preparing for a future that might not come is a moment lost forever. The ego that understands its finitude lives intensely in the present, rather than sacrificing the present for some future good. But this intensity is not desperate hedonism. Stirner is not advocating that we pursue immediate pleasure without thought for consequences. He is saying that we should live for ourselves rather than for abstractions, that we should create our own purposes rather than accepting imposed ones, that we should make our own judgments rather than deferring to authority. How we choose to live is less important than that we choose consciously and for ourselves. The fear of death is often what makes people subordinate themselves to fixed ideas. Religion promises immortality if we obey divine commands. Ideological movements promise that our contributions will outlive us, that we will be remembered, that our work will continue. These promises are designed to make death seem less final, less terrible. But they exact a price. We must live according to the fixed idea's demands rather than our own desires. Stirner would say that accepting death's finality is liberating rather than terrifying. It frees us from the need to justify our existence to cosmic or historical standards. It makes our choices genuinely our own because nothing beyond our current will constrain them. It allows us to live without the burden of eternal significance or ultimate purpose. Legacy and reputation are simply more subtle forms of seeking immortality. When people worry about how they will be remembered, they are subordinating their present life to concerns about the future after their death. But the dead do not experience their own legacy. Reputation benefits the living who cultivate it, or those who come after, not the dead themselves. Working for legacy means serving an abstraction rather than living for oneself. This doesn't mean the egoist is indifferent to all future consequences. Actions have effects that extend beyond the moment, and these effects may matter to my present interests. I might invest effort in projects that will bear fruit later, cultivate relationships that will provide future satisfaction, or build capacities that will serve me in years to come. But these are still forms of present self-interest, not service to something beyond myself. Children might seem to challenge this analysis. Parents often say they work and sacrifice for their children's future. But Stirner would say this is still egoistic. The parent does this because it satisfies something in them, not because they have an obligation. The moment caring for children ceases to satisfy and becomes pure burden, the parent has no duty to continue. Most parents continue because the relationship satisfies them more than it burdens them. The prospect of my own death is different from the death of others. Other people's deaths affect me insofar as they impact my life. I lose relationships, resources, or pleasures. But ultimately their deaths matter only because of what they mean for me. This sounds callous, but Stirner would say it is simply honest. We mourn our own loss, not the dead person's loss of life. The dead person has no loss because they no longer exist to experience loss. Stirner's acceptance of death is neither tragic nor celebratory, but simply matter of fact. Death is natural, inevitable, and final. Trying to escape it through religion, philosophy, or ideological immortality is futile and leads to subordinating actual life to abstract promises. Better to accept finitude and live consciously within it, creating whatever meaning and satisfaction is possible for temporary beings like ourselves. Part 10. The Dissolution of the World. One of Stirner's most radical moves is what he calls the dissolution, or destruction of the world. This doesn't mean physical annihilation, but rather the recognition that what we call the world is largely a construction of fixed ideas. When we dissolve these fixed ideas, the world as we understood it disappears, replaced by a different understanding that centers on the ego and its interests. The conventional worldview treats external reality as having objective existence and authority independent of the individual. There is a world out there with its own nature, its own laws, its own purposes. We are part of this world and must conform ourselves to its requirements. Science discovers the world's laws. Morality tells us how to live in the world properly. Religion reveals the world's ultimate meaning and purpose. But Stirner invites us to recognize that this worldview is itself a fixed idea. The world as independently existing authority is a construction that serves to subordinate individuals. When we say, nature demands this, or reality requires that, we are treating abstractions as having power over us. We are allowing ideas about the world to govern how we act and think. Dissolving the world means recognizing that the world matters only insofar as it affects me, only insofar as it enters my experience and impacts my interests. The world, as an idea, as a system with its own authority, is simply another ghost that haunts consciousness. The actual world, the particular objects, people, and events I encounter, is just material for me to use or avoid according to my purposes. This doesn't deny the existence of physical reality. Stirner is not claiming that nothing exists outside consciousness, or that reality is purely subjective. He is making a practical point about orientation. The question is not whether external reality exists, but whether it has authority over me, whether it determines what I should do and think. The dissolved world is reality without authority, existence without significance beyond what I give it. Science provides a useful example. Conventional understanding treats scientific truth as something we discover and must accept. Nature works in certain ways, and we must conform our beliefs and actions to these ways. But Stirner would say that scientific truth matters only insofar as it helps me achieve my purposes. I use science as a tool, not as a master. When scientific truth conflicts with my interests, I am free to ignore it, though I may suffer practical consequences for doing so. Moral truth is even more clearly a construction. There is no objective good or evil, except in the sense that these ideas exist in people's minds and affect their behavior. When I dissolve the moral world, I recognize that good and evil are simply labels that serve particular interests. What some call good may harm me, what some call evil may benefit me. The question is never what is truly good or evil, but what serves my purposes. The social world is perhaps the most important to dissolve. Society treats itself as real and authoritative. We speak of social obligations, social roles, social expectations as if these had independent existence and binding force. But society is simply other people and the ideas in their minds. When I dissolve the social world, I see through the illusion of collective authority and recognize only particular individuals with particular interests that may align or conflict with mine. Dissolving the world is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice. The world constantly reconstitutes itself in consciousness. Fixed ideas constantly reassert their authority. We fall back into treating abstractions as real and authoritative. The egoist must continually renew the dissolution, continually recognize and reject the authority of ideas. This practice of dissolution is what Stirner means by being creative nothing. The ego is nothing in the sense that it has no fixed nature or essence. It is creative in that it constantly creates itself and its world through its actions and interpretations. The creative nothing dissolves all fixed forms and creates new ones according to its interests, then dissolves these in turn when they become constraints. The dissolved world is not chaos or meaninglessness. It is simply reality without independent authority, existence that serves the ego rather than the ego serving it. Objects still have properties and relationships. Other people still have interests and power. Actions still have consequences. But none of this has normative force. None of it tells me what I ought to do. It simply presents me with possibilities and constraints within which I pursue my purposes. Living in the dissolved world requires constant vigilance against the tendency to reify ideas, to treat them as having independent existence and authority. Language itself encourages this reification. We speak of society as if it were an agent, of nature as if it made demands, of history as if it had purposes. Recognizing these as linguistic conveniences rather than real entities is part of maintaining the dissolution. The dissolved world is the world as experienced by the fully conscious egoist who recognizes that all meaning and value originates in individual consciousness rather than existing objectively. This is not solipsism, but rather a kind of radical subjectivism that acknowledges external existence while denying external authority. The world exists, but does not command. Reality constrains, but does not obligate. Part 11. Stirner's critics and their misunderstandings. Stirner's philosophy provoked immediate and sustained criticism from across the political and philosophical spectrum. These criticisms often reveal more about the critic's own fixed ideas than about genuine problems in Stirner's thought. Understanding the critiques helps clarify what Stirner actually claimed and why his philosophy remains so threatening to conventional thinking. Marx devoted hundreds of pages in The German Ideology to attacking Stirner, though he never published this polemic during his lifetime. Marx accused Stirner of abstract individualism, of failing to understand that individuals are socially constituted, of ignoring material conditions and class struggle. But these criticisms miss Stirner's point. Stirner never denied social conditioning or material constraints. He simply refused to treat these as normative, as determining what individuals ought to do or be. Marx wanted to liberate the working class, to achieve human emancipation through revolutionary transformation of material conditions. Stirner saw this as simply creating new, fixed ideas: the proletariat, the revolution, communism. These abstractions would demand individual sacrifice just as surely as God or the state. Marx's vision of liberated humanity was still a vision of individuals subordinating themselves to collective purposes, still a form of slavery disguised as freedom. Religious critics accused Stirner of nihilism, of destroying all values and meaning. They saw his rejection of God and morality as leading inevitably to chaos and despair. But Stirner was not destroying values. He was relocating their source from abstract ideals to individual choice. The egoist creates values consciously, rather than accepting imposed ones. This is not nihilism, but radical autonomy. Liberal critics worried that Stirner's philosophy would lead to violence and disorder. If everyone pursues their own interests without moral constraints, won't society collapse into a war of all against all? But Stirner recognized that individuals often have interests in cooperation and peace. The union of egoists is precisely how individuals can pursue their interests more effectively through voluntary association. The difference is that this cooperation is based on honest self-interest rather than moral obligation. Anarchist critics, particularly social anarchists, accuse Stirner of undermining solidarity and collective action. They believe that fighting oppression requires people to unite based on shared principles and common humanity. Stirner's insistence on individual interest seemed to make such unity impossible. But Stirner would respond that solidarity based on abstractions is fragile and ultimately coercive. Genuine cooperation requires honest acknowledgement of interests rather than appeals to principles. Modern critics often accuse Stirner of being impractical or utopian. They point out that his union of egoists has never been implemented, that his vision of a society without authority seems impossible. But Stirner was not proposing a political program or social blueprint. He was describing an attitude, a way of thinking and acting that individuals can adopt regardless of social circumstances. The egoist can exist in any society, by refusing internalized authority, even when external authority must be pragmatically accommodated. Perhaps the deepest criticism is that Stirner's philosophy is self-refuting. If everything is just my ego and its interests, why should anyone else care about or accept this philosophy? Stirner would reply that they shouldn't accept it based on its truth or its benefits for humanity. They might adopt it because it serves their interests, helps them think more clearly, or provides tools for liberation. The philosophy makes no universal claims and seeks no general acceptance. Some critics argue that Stirner's radical individualism makes genuine relationships impossible. If I see others only as means to my ends, how can I have authentic love or friendship? But Stirner would say that relationships based on honest self-interest are more authentic than those based on duty or moral obligation. I love someone because loving them satisfies me, not because they deserve love or because love is good. This honesty makes the relationship more genuine, not less. The accusation of selfishness is constant but misplaced. Stirner is not advocating selfishness as a moral position. He is describing the ego as it actually is, always acting from self-interest even when it claims altruistic motives. The question is not whether to be selfish, but whether to be honest about it. Conventional morality encourages dishonesty by requiring that we disguise self-interest as principle. Feminist critics have pointed out that Stirner's philosophy seems to ignore power differences and oppression. If might makes right, and everyone just pursues their interests, doesn't this justify the oppression of the weak by the strong? Stirner would respond that he is not justifying anything. Justification itself is a moral concept he rejects. He is describing how power actually works. Recognizing this honestly may actually be more useful for the oppressed than believing in abstract rights that the powerful ignore. The criticism that Stirner offers no positive vision of the good life also misses the point. He deliberately refuses to prescribe what people should do or value. The good life for each ego is whatever that ego chooses to pursue. Providing a universal vision of the good life would simply create another fixed idea, another standard to which individuals should conform. The whole point is that each individual creates their own purposes and values. Some interpreters have tried to incorporate Stirner into various political movements: anarchism, libertarianism, existentialism. These appropriations inevitably distort his thought by subordinating it to ideological purposes. Stirner cannot be made into an anarchist because anarchism is a political philosophy with principles and goals. He cannot be made into an existentialist because existentialism is a philosophical school with doctrines and commitments. He remains stubbornly irreducible to any category or movement, the most sophisticated. Critics recognize that Stirner's philosophy is coherent and powerful on its own terms, but they question whether it is livable. Can anyone actually live as Stirner describes, completely free from fixed ideas and moral obligations? Perhaps Stirner describes an impossible ideal rather than a realistic possibility. But even if complete liberation is impossible, the attempt may be valuable. Recognizing and dissolving fixed ideas, even partially, expands freedom and autonomy. Part 12. Language, Truth, and the Tyranny of Concepts. Language is one of the most powerful mechanisms through which fixed ideas maintain their authority over consciousness. Stirner recognized that the very words we use carry implicit assumptions, embedded values, and hidden demands. When we speak, we are not simply describing reality, but participating in a system of concepts that shapes what we can think and what we are expected to believe. Understanding how language functions as a form of authority is crucial to achieving genuine autonomy. Every language contains within it a particular worldview, a set of assumptions about what exists and what matters. The distinctions a language makes reflect the concerns and values of the culture that created it. When we learn a language, we are not just learning labels for pre-existing things, but absorbing a way of organizing and interpreting experience. The language we speak shapes what we notice, what we ignore, and what possibilities we can imagine. Moral language is particularly insidious because it smuggles normative claims into apparently descriptive statements. When someone says, "that is wrong," they appear to be stating a fact about the world. But they are actually making a demand disguised as a description. They are telling you that you ought to condemn this action, that you should feel moral disapproval, that you are required to join in condemnation. The language of right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice always carries these hidden imperatives. Abstract nouns are especially problematic because they reify processes and relationships into things. We speak of society, humanity, the state, justice, freedom, as if these were entities that exist independently of the particular individuals and interactions they supposedly describe. But these abstractions have no existence except as concepts in minds. When we treat them as real entities with their own interests and demands, we have created fixed ideas that can then claim authority over us. Stirner saw that philosophical and political discourse is largely a battle over concepts and definitions. Rival ideologies disagree about what freedom really means, what justice truly requires, what human nature essentially is. But these disputes miss the fundamental point. All of these concepts are human creations, tools that can be used for various purposes. The question is never what freedom or justice truly is, but what purposes these concepts serve when used in particular ways. The quest for truth itself can become a fixed idea when it demands that we subordinate our interests to objective reality. Science and philosophy claim to pursue truth regardless of consequences, to follow arguments wherever they lead, to accept conclusions even when they contradict our preferences. This sounds noble, but it treats truth as an authority that stands above individual judgment and interest. It tells us we must believe what is true, rather than what serves us. Stirner would not deny that accurate beliefs about reality are often useful. Knowing how things actually work helps us achieve our purposes. But the relationship should be instrumental. I seek truth when and because it serves me, not because I have an obligation to truth for its own sake. When truth conflicts with my interests, when knowing reality would harm rather than help me, I have no duty to pursue it. Truth is a tool, not a master. This raises the question of whether we can consciously believe what we know to be false. Can I choose to believe something simply because believing it serves my interests? This seems psychologically difficult or impossible, but Stirner would say that we do this constantly without recognizing it. People believe what they want to believe, what makes them comfortable, what serves their self-image. The difference is whether we do this consciously and honestly, or whether we deceive ourselves about our motivations. Political language provides endless examples of how words shape thought and constrain possibilities. Terms like rights, equality, justice, and freedom all carry enormous emotional weight and seem to describe objective values that everyone should recognize. But each term can be defined in multiple ways, each definition serving different interests. Arguing about the correct definition is pointless. What matters is recognizing that these are contested concepts used to advance particular agendas. The language of identity is particularly powerful in contemporary culture. To say, I am something, a Christian, a socialist, an American, a woman, is to claim an identity that supposedly determines what you should believe and how you should act. Identity language treats these categories as essential rather than chosen, as defining rather than describing. But Stirner would insist that you are not essentially anything. You are the unique one who cannot be captured in any category. Pronouns and naming raise fascinating questions about language and power. The contemporary battles over preferred pronouns reflect the recognition that language shapes how we think about ourselves and others. Those who insist on particular pronouns are trying to control how they are conceptualized and discussed. Those who resist are asserting their own authority to categorize others as they see fit. Stirner would see both sides as fighting over symbolic power while missing the deeper point. No name or pronoun can capture the unique individual. The tyranny of concepts extends even to self-understanding. When we think about ourselves, we use concepts and categories that are not our own creation. We describe ourselves using the language society has given us, fitting ourselves into existing categories, evaluating ourselves against external standards. Even the idea of a true self is a concept that may not correspond to anything real. The unique one cannot be captured in concepts, even in concepts about oneself. Stirner's own writing style reflects his awareness of language's power and limitations. He writes provocatively, using conventional moral and political terms, while simultaneously undermining them. He speaks of egoism, while insisting that egoism is not a moral doctrine. He uses the word property, while radically redefining what it means. He deploys the language of his opponents against itself, showing how their own concepts lead to conclusions they would reject. The question becomes, how can we communicate at all if we reject conventional language and concepts? Stirner's answer is that we must use language strategically and consciously, aware that all concepts are tools rather than truths. We can speak of rights while recognizing that rights are claims backed by power. We can use moral language while understanding that morality is a social construction. We can employ philosophical terms while remaining aware that they distort as much as they clarify. Creating new language is tempting, but ultimately futile. New terms quickly become just as constraining as old ones. They develop their own associations and assumptions, their own ways of shaping thought. The solution is not to invent a perfect language free from fixed ideas, but to maintain a critical awareness of how all language functions to shape consciousness and constrain possibility. Silence itself can be a form of resistance to linguistic tyranny. Refusing to participate in debates framed by concepts you reject, declining to take positions on controversies defined by categories you don't accept, remaining silent when expected to speak. These can be ways of refusing to subordinate yourself to linguistic demands. Sometimes the most radical response to a question is to reject the question rather than answer it. The egoist's relationship to language is paradoxical. Language is necessary for thought and communication, yet it inevitably imports fixed ideas and constrains consciousness. The solution is not to escape language, but to use it consciously and critically, always aware of its power and always resisting its tendency to reify abstractions into authorities. This requires constant vigilance because the tendency to treat concepts as real is deeply ingrained and constantly reinforced by social interaction. Part 13. The Stirnerian Critique of Love and Relationships. Love occupies a peculiar position in human culture. It is simultaneously celebrated as the highest human emotion and used as a mechanism of control and obligation. Romantic love, parental love, love of humanity, all are held up as ideals that should govern behavior and constrain individual freedom. Stirner's analysis of love is characteristically radical. He strips away the sentimental mystifications to reveal love as another form of egoistic satisfaction that becomes problematic only when treated as a duty or obligation. Traditional morality treats love as inherently good and deserving of cultivation. Christianity commands us to love our neighbors and even our enemies. Humanism tells us to love humanity and work for the common good. Romantic ideology tells us that true love requires sacrifice and selflessness. In each case, love is presented as something we ought to feel, a duty rather than a spontaneous emotion. This transformation of love into obligation is precisely what Stirner attacks. When someone says, "I love you," what are they actually expressing? Conventionally, this statement claims that the beloved has inherent value, that they deserve love regardless of what they do for the lover. The statement seems to be about the beloved rather than the lover, but Stirner insists that love is always about the lover's satisfaction. I love you because loving you satisfies something in me. Perhaps you make me happy. Perhaps you fulfill my needs. Perhaps loving you makes me feel good about myself. The moment you cease to provide this satisfaction, genuine love disappears even if I continue to perform loving actions from duty or habit. This sounds cynical and even cruel, but Stirner would argue it is simply honest. The person who claims to love selflessly is either self-deceived or dishonest. They love because loving satisfies them, because the beloved provides something they want or need. This doesn't make the love less genuine or less valuable. It simply locates its source accurately in the lover's satisfaction rather than in the beloved's inherent worth. Romantic love is particularly mystified in modern culture. We are told that true love is unconditional, eternal, and self-sacrificing. We are supposed to love the other person for who they really are, to accept them completely, to commit ourselves permanently. But this ideology serves to trap people in relationships that no longer satisfy them, to make them feel guilty for changing desires, to prevent them from acknowledging that love is conditional and temporary. Stirner would say that genuine love is always conditional. Conditional on the beloved continuing to satisfy the lover's needs and desires. When these needs change, or when the beloved no longer satisfies them, love naturally fades. Treating this as tragedy or failure misunderstands the nature of love. Love is a state of satisfaction that exists in the present. It cannot and should not be projected indefinitely into the future. Promising eternal love is either self-deception or a promise you cannot know you will keep. The romantic ideal of finding your other half or soulmate is another fixed idea that Stirner would reject. It treats the individual as incomplete, as lacking something that only another person can provide. But the unique one is complete in itself, self-sufficient, not needing another to become whole. Relationships are valued when they enhance satisfaction, not because they complete some essential lack. The moment a relationship becomes a need rather than a choice, the individual has subordinated themselves to another person. Sexual desire and love are often confused, but are actually distinct phenomena. Sexual desire is straightforwardly egoistic. I want pleasure and seek it with partners who can provide it. Romantic love adds layers of commitment, obligation, and expectation that transform a simple exchange of pleasure into something more complex and constraining. Stirner would not object to the complexity, but would insist on recognizing that even romantic love is fundamentally egoistic, based on mutual satisfaction, rather than on the beloved's inherent value. Jealousy reveals the possessive nature of love that romantic ideology tries to disguise. We become jealous when our partner shows interest in others because we fear losing a source of satisfaction. This is honest egoism. But romantic ideology tells us that jealousy is bad, that we should trust our partners, that true love transcends possessiveness. This simply makes us feel guilty for natural reactions while not actually changing the underlying dynamic. Parental love presents particular challenges for Stirner's analysis. Parents often claim that their love for children is purely selfless, that they would sacrifice anything for their children's welfare. But Stirner would insist that parents care for children because doing so satisfies them. Perhaps they enjoy the relationship. Perhaps they cannot bear to see their children suffer. Perhaps they want to feel like good parents. These are all forms of egoistic satisfaction, even if they involve behavior that appears sacrificial. The concept of unconditional love is particularly problematic. Parents are told they should love their children unconditionally, regardless of what the children do or become. But this is simply another moral demand disguised as natural emotion. Real love is always conditional on the beloved continuing to be lovable in some way. We may have very loose conditions. We may continue loving children even when they disappoint or harm us, but these are still conditions. Pretending otherwise creates false obligations and unrealistic expectations. Friendship in Stirner's framework is simply mutual egoistic satisfaction without the romantic mystifications. Friends associate because they enjoy each other's company, because the relationship provides benefits, because each satisfies something in the other. When the benefits cease or the relationship becomes burdensome, friends naturally drift apart. Mourning the end of friendship as tragic loss misunderstands its nature. Friendships exist in the present. They need not be eternal to be valuable. Love of humanity or universal love is the most abstract and most problematic form of love. How can you love people you have never met, who have no individual reality for you, who exist only as abstract members of the category humanity? This love is really love of an abstraction, devotion to a fixed idea. It demands that you sacrifice your interests for people who mean nothing to you personally, that you value the abstract concept of humanity more than your own concrete existence. The union of egoists treats relationships differently from conventional morality. Two egoists come together because each satisfies the other. They remain together as long as the satisfaction continues. They separate when it ends. There are no obligations, no duties, no commitments beyond current will. This seems cold, but Stirner would argue it is more honest and actually creates more genuine relationships than those based on duty and obligation. Marriage as a legal and social institution is particularly constraining because it transforms a voluntary association based on satisfaction into a legal contract backed by state power and social pressure. The married couple are told they must stay together for better or worse, that they have obligations to each other, that divorce is failure. This traps people in relationships that no longer satisfy them and makes them feel guilty for wanting to leave. The egoist might participate in marriage for practical benefits, but would not accept it as creating binding obligations. The question of children's rights and parental obligations is difficult for Stirner's philosophy. Children are genuinely dependent and cannot survive without care. Do parents have obligations to their children? Stirner would say no. Parents care for children because they want to, because abandoning children would make them feel terrible, because they love their children in the egoistic sense. When these motivations disappear, there is no deeper obligation. This sounds harsh, but it may be more honest than pretending that parental duty is something beyond parental desire. Love becomes pathological when it turns into worship, when the beloved becomes an idol demanding sacrifice and subordination. Some people lose themselves in love, treating the beloved's interests as more important than their own, sacrificing their autonomy for the relationship. This is not genuine love, but self-abnegation, treating another person as a fixed idea that claims authority over one's own existence. The egoist loves while maintaining self-ownership, enjoying the beloved without worshipping them. The deepest insight from Stirner's analysis is that relationships based on honest egoistic satisfaction are actually more reliable and more genuine than those based on duty and moral obligation. When I help you because I want to, you can trust my assistance more than if I help because I believe I ought to. When we stay together because we enjoy each other, the relationship is more authentic than one maintained by obligation. Honesty about self-interest creates more stable relationships than dishonesty disguised as altruism. Part 14. Stirner and the Problem of Power. Power is central to Stirner's philosophy, yet his analysis of power differs fundamentally from both conventional political theory and radical critiques of domination. Where liberals worry about limiting power through rights and constitutions, and radicals dream of eliminating power through equality and solidarity. Stirner accepts power as fundamental to human existence and focuses on how individuals can maximize their own power while navigating power relationships with others. Traditional political philosophy distinguishes between legitimate and illegitimate power, between authority and mere force. Legitimate power is supposedly based on consent, natural rights, or rational principles. Illegitimate power is supposedly based on coercion and violence. But Stirner rejects this distinction as another moral mystification. All power is simply the capacity to compel others to do what you want. Whether this capacity is legitimate or illegitimate is a question that matters only to those who still believe in fixed ideas, like justice and rights. The state claims legitimate authority based on various justifications: divine right, social contract, democratic consent, or revolutionary mandate. But Stirner sees through all these justifications to the reality beneath. The state has power because it can punish those who disobey. I follow laws not because the state has legitimate authority, but because I fear the consequences of breaking them. When the consequences of disobedience are worth bearing, or when the state lacks power to punish me, laws cease to bind. This does not mean that Stirner advocates breaking laws or recommends conflict with the state. The egoist makes practical calculations about when obedience serves their interests and when disobedience does. Sometimes obeying is easier and more beneficial than resisting. Sometimes the cost of resistance is too high. The point is not that we should always resist, but that we should recognize our obedience as a practical choice rather than as fulfillment of a moral obligation. Power is not simply something possessed by states and institutions, but something that operates in all human relationships. Parents have power over children. Employers have power over workers. Teachers have power over students. The beautiful have power over those who desire them. The articulate have power over the inarticulate. Power is the fundamental medium through which humans interact, though we disguise this reality with talk of love, duty, and mutual respect. Stirner's analysis anticipates what Foucault would later call microphysics of power, the recognition that power operates not just through grand political institutions, but through countless everyday interactions and relationships. Every conversation is a power struggle over meaning and interpretation. Every relationship involves negotiation over who will defer to whom. Every social interaction includes elements of dominance and submission, though these are usually subtle and disguised. But where Foucault focuses on how power shapes subjects and constitutes identities, Stirner maintains focus on the ego that can resist this shaping. Power may attempt to constitute me as a subject, but I remain the unique one who can reject imposed identities and definitions. The question is always whether I will accept the identity that power tries to impose, or whether I will assert my own self-definition against these external forces. The relationship between power and property illuminates both concepts. Property is not a natural right, but a function of power. I own what I can take and hold against others' claims. If you can take something from me and I cannot prevent you, it was not really my property regardless of legal titles or moral claims. If I can take something from you and you cannot prevent me, it becomes my property regardless of whether I have any right to it. This might seem to advocate a war of all against all, with everyone simply trying to seize what they can. But Stirner recognizes that such constant conflict is usually not in anyone's interest. Most people most of the time find it more useful to cooperate, to respect each other's possessions, to create stable arrangements that allow for planning and security. But these arrangements are based on mutual self-interest and relative power, not on moral principles or natural rights. The powerful justify their power through ideology, through fixed ideas that make domination seem natural, legitimate, or even beneficial for the dominated. The wealthy claim that property rights are sacred and that inequality reflects merit. The educated claim that expertise should be respected and that credentials matter. The politically powerful claim that authority is necessary for social order. Each justification is simply a way of disguising naked power as something more respectable. Stirner's response is not to create a counter-ideology of liberation, but to recognize all justifications as rhetorical strategies. When the powerful speak of rights, order, or merit, they are simply trying to make their power seem legitimate. When the powerless speak of justice, equality, or revolution, they are trying to mobilize opposition to existing power. Both sides are pursuing their interests. The difference is only in their relative power and the strategies they employ. This analysis might seem to leave the powerless with no resources against domination. If might makes right, doesn't this justify oppression? But Stirner would reject the question itself. He is not justifying anything. Justification is a moral concept he rejects. He is describing how power actually works. Recognizing this honestly may actually empower the dominated more than believing in abstract rights that the powerful ignore. The dominated can increase their power through organization, through collective action, through strategic resistance. But Stirner insists that such organization should be based on honest, mutual self-interest, rather than on ideology or principle. The union of egoists is more powerful than either isolated individuals or masses unified by abstract ideals. Isolated individuals can be defeated one by one. Masses unified by ideology can be controlled by manipulating the ideology. But egoists cooperating for mutual benefit are harder to control because their cooperation is voluntary and tactical. Violence occupies an ambiguous place in Stirner's philosophy. He neither celebrates nor condemns it, but treats it as one form of power among others. Sometimes violence is the most effective way to achieve one's purposes. Sometimes it is counterproductive. The question is never whether violence is morally wrong, but whether it serves one's interests better than alternatives. This sounds shocking, but it is actually how violence has always functioned, despite moral rhetoric to the contrary. The monopoly on violence that states claim is simply the most successful power grab in human history. States convince people that only the state may legitimately use violence, that individual or group violence is always wrong, that resistance to state violence is criminal. But this is simply propaganda designed to maintain state power. The state's violence is not more legitimate than any other violence. It is simply more powerful and better organized. Stirner's concept of power differs from Nietzsche's will to power, though there are similarities. Nietzsche treats will to power as a cosmic principle, as the fundamental drive in all life. Stirner makes no such metaphysical claims. He simply observes that individuals seek to maximize their capacity to achieve their purposes, to get what they want, to avoid what they don't want. This seeking is not a metaphysical principle, but a practical fact about how humans actually behave. The question of empowerment is important for understanding Stirner's relevance. While he offers no political program, his philosophy can be empowering for those who feel trapped by ideologies, obligations, and social expectations. Recognizing that all these constraints are ultimately self-imposed, that you have the power to reject them if you are willing to accept the consequences, can be profoundly liberating. You are more powerful than you think, because the chains that bind you are largely in your own mind. Yet Stirner also recognizes the reality of unequal power. Some people have more power than others due to physical strength, wealth, social position, or institutional authority. Recognizing this inequality honestly is more useful than pretending that everyone has equal rights or equal dignity. The question is not how to achieve equality, which Stirner would regard as another fixed idea, but how each individual can maximize their own power within existing constraints. The ultimate form of power for Stirner is self-ownership, the power to determine oneself, to resist external control, to use oneself for one's own purposes rather than being used by others. This power is always contested and never complete, but it is the power that matters most. Material wealth, political authority, and social status are valuable only insofar as they contribute to self-ownership. Without self-ownership, all other forms of power are empty because you are still being controlled by fixed ideas and external demands. Part 15. Stirner for the 21st century. We live in an age that makes Stirner's critique more relevant than ever. Identity politics has created new forms of fixed ideas, identities, privileges, and oppressions that claim authority over individual thought and action. Social media generates moral panics and demands for conformity. Political polarization creates tribal loyalties that override individual judgment. Woke ideology and cultural conservatism both tell people what they must believe, how they must speak, what they must value. The contemporary emphasis on identity is particularly Stirnerian. We are told that our race, gender, sexuality, and other characteristics determine who we are and what we should believe. These identities are treated as essential rather than chosen, as defining rather than describing. Identity politics tells individuals they must think and act according to their identity categories rather than as unique individuals. This is precisely the kind of fixed idea that Stirner attacked. Social media creates what we might call manufactured outrage. People are constantly being told they should be angry about various issues, should care about particular causes, should take positions on controversies. The algorithm rewards moral posturing and punishes independent thinking. Everyone is expected to have the right opinions on every topic and to express these opinions with appropriate intensity. Stirner would recognize this as mob rule disguised as social consciousness. Cancel culture represents the enforcement mechanism for contemporary fixed ideas. Those who violate the current moral consensus face professional and social destruction. The specific content of the consensus may vary between political tribes, but the structure is the same. There are correct opinions and incorrect ones, and expressing incorrect opinions must be punished. Stirner would see this as collective tyranny more oppressive than individual authoritarianism because it claims moral authority. The therapeutic culture of self-care and mental health awareness has created new fixed ideas about the self. We are told we must process our trauma, practice self-compassion, establish boundaries, and prioritize our mental health. These sound like forms of self-ownership, but they become fixed ideas when they prescribe how we should relate to ourselves. The therapeutic self is another abstract ideal claiming authority over actual selves. Consumer capitalism offers a particularly insidious form of false liberation. It tells us we can express our individuality through consumer choices, that we can create our identity through the products we buy and the experiences we consume. But this treats individuality itself as a commodity, something we acquire rather than something we are. The unique one cannot be purchased or constructed from ready-made components. Political polarization has created tribal identities that demand loyalty and conformity. To be progressive or conservative means accepting a package of positions on various issues. Independent thinking is treated as suspicious or impossible. You must be on one side or the other, and choosing a side means accepting its entire worldview. Stirner would see both sides as offering different, fixed ideas, demanding the same subordination of individual judgment. The surveillance state, both governmental and corporate, tracks and monitors individual behavior in unprecedented ways. This surveillance is often justified by appeals to security, public health, or preventing harm. But Stirner would recognize it as an attempt to control individuals by monitoring their deviation from desired norms. The surveilled self is not free because it must constantly consider how its actions will be perceived and judged. Technology and social media have amplified the mechanisms by which fixed ideas spread and enforce themselves. Viral outrage, online mobs, and algorithmic amplification of extreme content all serve to police thinking and punish deviation. The internet was supposed to liberate information and enable independent thinking. Instead, it has created new forms of conformity and new ways to enforce ideological discipline. The pandemic of 2020 to 2021 revealed how quickly societies impose new fixed ideas and demand obedience. Public health became a moral absolute that justified unprecedented restrictions on individual freedom. Those who questioned policies or refused compliance were treated as moral failures, as threats to collective welfare. Stirner would recognize this as the subordination of individual judgment to abstract collective goods. Climate activism often functions as a secular religion complete with original sin, carbon emissions, redemption, sustainable living, and apocalypse, climate catastrophe. Individuals are told they must change their behavior for the sake of future generations and the planet. This is precisely the kind of fixed idea that demands individual sacrifice for abstract ideals. Stirner would not deny climate change, but would reject the moral framework that treats individual flourishing as less important than collective survival. Yet contemporary culture also provides resources for Stirnerian resistance. The very proliferation of fixed ideas makes their constructed nature more visible. When moral panics contradict each other or change rapidly, their arbitrary nature becomes apparent. When ideologies offer competing absolute truths, their relativity becomes clear. The chaos of contemporary culture makes it harder to believe in any single authority or truth. The individualism that consumer capitalism promotes, despite being commodified and superficial, has made people more aware of their right to choose their own values and lifestyles. This awareness can be deepened and radicalized into genuine self-ownership. The therapeutic focus on the self, despite creating new fixed ideas, has also made people more willing to question external authorities and trust their own experience. The information abundance of the digital age makes it easier to research alternative viewpoints, to compare different perspectives, to see through propaganda and manipulation. While algorithms create echo chambers, they also make it possible to escape echo chambers for those willing to make the effort. The tools of surveillance and control are also tools of education and liberation, if used consciously. Stirner's philosophy offers several crucial insights for contemporary life. First, recognize that all the passionate moral and political demands of our time are simply more fixed ideas. They may have different content from traditional religion and morality, but they have the same structure and serve the same function. Second, resist the pressure to have the correct opinions on everything. You are not obligated to care about every cause or take a position on every controversy. Third, distinguish between genuine self-interest and the interests that ideologies tell you to have. Fourth, form alliances and associations based on honest mutual benefit, rather than on shared ideology or identity. The path forward requires exactly the kind of radical individualism that Stirner exemplified, refusing all fixed ideas while remaining engaged with actual reality, creating values consciously rather than accepting imposed ones, cooperating with others when it serves mutual interests without subordinating oneself to collective demands, living honestly about self-interest rather than disguising it as principle, recognizing all authorities as claims to power rather than as legitimate right. These are difficult practices in a world that constantly demands conformity, but they are necessary for anyone who seeks genuine autonomy. Stirner offers no system, no doctrine, no program. He provides a critique that dissolves all systems and a vision of the ego as creative nothing that constantly creates and destroys forms without becoming fixed in any of them. Whether anyone can actually live this way is questionable. Perhaps complete freedom from fixed ideas is impossible for social beings whose very thoughts are shaped by language and culture. But even if Stirner's vision is an impossible ideal, striving toward it expands freedom and autonomy. Every fixed idea we recognize and dissolve is one less constraint on our thinking and acting. Every obligation we question is a potential opening for genuine choice. Every authority we reject is a space for self-ownership. The value of Stirner's philosophy lies not in achieving perfect autonomy, but in the continuous practice of questioning, dissolving, and resisting. The unique one remains Stirner's most powerful and most challenging concept. You are unique not because of your special qualities or achievements, but simply because you are you and not someone else. This uniqueness cannot be captured in categories, cannot be reduced to general concepts, cannot be made to serve universal purposes. You are irreducibly particular, incomparably individual. Living as the unique one means recognizing that no philosophy, including Stirner's, can tell you how to live. It means taking ownership of yourself and your choices without reference to any external standard or internal essence. It means creating yourself continuously through your actions while recognizing that this created self is always temporary and revisable. It means pursuing your interests honestly without disguising them as principles or duties. Stirner died alone and forgotten, his revolutionary book seemingly without lasting impact. But his ideas refused to die. They surfaced again and again in different contexts, influenced thinkers who often didn't know the source and continued to disturb and challenge readers who encounter them. This persistence suggests that Stirner identified something fundamental about human existence and human possibility, something that cannot be eliminated or domesticated by more comfortable philosophies. The ego stands alone. It owes nothing to anyone. It is bound by no principles, obligations, or ideals except those it chooses to accept for its own reasons. It creates its own meaning in a universe that has none. It lives briefly and intensely before returning to nothingness. This is neither tragedy nor triumph, but simply the human condition honestly acknowledged. Stirner's ghost still haunts philosophy and politics, still disturbs comfortable certainties, still challenges every form of authority and every abstract ideal. His question remains: will you live for yourself, or will you serve phantoms? The answer cannot be given once and for all, but must be renewed continuously through how we choose to think and act. The eternal fire of which Heraclitus spoke finds its echo in Stirner's unique one. Both are processes rather than substances. Both exist only in continuous self-creation. Both burn briefly before being extinguished. But where Heraclitus saw cosmic patterns and universal logos, Stirner saw only individual egos creating temporary meanings in a meaningless universe. Both are right. We are natural processes obeying physical laws, and we are unique individuals creating ourselves freely. The challenge is holding both truths simultaneously without reducing one to the other. In the end, Stirner offers us not a doctrine to believe, but a practice to undertake. The practice of radical autonomy, of continuous questioning, of refusing all fixed ideas while remaining engaged with concrete reality. This practice is difficult and never complete, but it is the only path to genuine freedom for beings like us in conditions like ours. The unique one calls to each of us to take ownership of ourselves and live consciously as the irreducible individuals we are. The fire burns on, briefly but intensely, creating its own light in the darkness.